The sun was setting as Mike pulled into his driveway, its orange glow reflecting off the windows of his new home. After 5 years of saving every extra penny from his graphic design job, he'd finally done it. Bought his very first house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom with faded blue siding in a quiet neighborhood called Oakwood Estates. But to Mike, it was everything. Home sweet home, he whispered to himself, feeling the weight of the new house keys in his pocket. The moving truck had left just hours ago, leaving behind stacks of boxes in every room. Mike's back ached from carrying furniture all day, but the pain couldn't dampen his excitement. After years of sharing thin-walled apartments with noisy neighbors and fighting for street parking, he now had his very own driveway and garage. The garage was currently stuffed with boxes he hadn't had time to sort through yet. That's why his dark blue sedan was parked in the driveway instead. Mike took a moment to admire how perfect it looked there. His car, his driveway, his house. He snapped a quick photo and sent it to his mom with the caption, "Finally made it." Kanki, Mike didn't know when he signed the closing papers was that Oakwood Estates had a homeowners association, an HOA. The real estate agent had mentioned it briefly, saying something about community standards and a small monthly fee. But Mike had been too excited about the affordable price to pay much attention. The stack of HOA documents was somewhere in the pile of paperwork he'd tossed on the kitchen counter, still unread. He also didn't know that his next-door neighbor, Diane, had been on the HOA board for the past 15 years until she'd been voted off last spring for being too strict. Diane didn't take the loss well. Though no longer officially in charge, she still considered herself the neighborhood's quality control manager, a title she'd given herself. From behind her living room curtains, Diane watched Mike park in his driveway with narrowed eyes. The previous owners, the Thompsons, had always kept their cars neatly tucked away in the garage, out of sight. "That's how it should be," she muttered to herself. "Nice neighborhoods don't look like parking lots." For now, Mike remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing next door. He ordered a pizza to celebrate his first night in the new house, ate it sitting on a box because he couldn't find his chairs yet, and fell asleep on his mattress on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes. As he drifted off to sleep, Mike smiled, thinking about all the possibilities this new chapter held. Maybe he'd plant a garden in the backyard. Maybe he'd finally get that dog he'd always wanted. Maybe he'd invite his friends over for barbecues on weekends. Little did he know that his simple decision to park in his own driveway would spark a neighborhood war that would test his patience, bring unexpected allies, and ultimately lead to a showdown none of the residents of Oakwood Estates would soon forget. 3 days had passed since Mike moved in. He was slowly making his house feel like a home, unpacking the essentials first. Kitchen stuff, bathroom necessities, and enough clothes to get by. The garage was still a maze of boxes, but he'd tackle that when he had a free weekend. That Wednesday afternoon, Mike ran to the grocery store to stock his empty fridge. He'd made a list on the back of an envelope: milk, eggs, bread, coffee, and enough frozen dinners to last until he figured out how to cook in his new kitchen. Nothing fancy, just the basics. He pulled into his driveway around 4:30. Plastic, grocery bags hanging from both arms as he fumbled with his house keys. That's when he noticed someone standing next to his car. A woman with shoulder-length hair dyed a reddish-brown color was holding her phone up, clearly taking pictures of his sedan. "Can I help you?" Mike called out, his confusion evident in his voice. The woman spun around, startled but quickly composing herself. She wore beige pants and a floral blouse with a cardigan despite the warm weather, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "I'm Diane Patterson from next door," she said, her tone clipped and formal like she was introducing herself at a business meeting rather than to a neighbor. "And you are clearly violating Section 8, Paragraph C of the Homeowners Association bylaws." Mike set his groceries down on the small patch of lawn beside the driveway. "I'm sorry. What?" "Vehicles are to be stored in garages, not on driveways," Diane stated, holding up her phone as if it contained irrefutable evidence. "It creates an unsightly appearance and lowers property values. The Thompsons never left their cars out." "Oh, I didn't realize," Mike said, trying to keep his tone friendly. "I'm still getting settled in. My garage is full of boxes right now, but once I unpack—" "Rules don't have exceptions for convenience," Diane interrupted. "I've been living here for 17 years, and I've never seen such a blatant disregard for community standards within days of moving in." Mike took a deep breath. He'd dealt with difficult co-workers before, so he knew not to let himself get worked up. "Look, Miss Patterson, I just moved in. I'm still organizing everything. My car will be in the garage as soon as I can make space for it." "That's not good enough," Diane replied, her voice rising slightly. "Either move it immediately or face the consequences." "Consequences?" Mike couldn't help but laugh a little. "It's my driveway. I own this property." Diane's face flushed red. "You may own the property, but you agreed to follow HOA rules when you purchased in Oakwood Estates. I have the entire rulebook memorized." "I haven't even had a chance to read through all that paperwork yet," Mike admitted, reaching down to pick up his groceries, which were now making his fingers numb. "And I really need to get these inside before my ice cream melts." "This isn't over," Diane warned, wagging her finger at him. "I used to be on the HOA board and I still have influence. I'll be watching your property." As she stormed off toward her house 2 doors down, Mike stood in his driveway, grocery bags in hand, completely bewildered by what had just happened. His first neighborhood interaction, and it was this? "Welcome to home ownership," he muttered to himself as he unlocked his front door, wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The morning after his run-in with Diane, Mike found a white piece of paper stuck to his front door. The header read, "Violation Notice," in bold letters. Beneath it was a typed message about improper vehicle storage and a reference to the HOA rulebook. Mike pulled it off with a sigh and added it to his growing pile of mail on the kitchen counter. "Great," he muttered, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He was already running late for work. 2 days later, a second notice appeared, this one in a sealed envelope marked "Urgent." Inside was a more strongly worded letter mentioning neighborhood aesthetic standards and homeowner responsibilities. There was also a $50 fine listed, which made Mike choke on his breakfast cereal. $50 for parking in my own driveway? "You've got to be kidding me," he said to his empty kitchen. His voice echoed slightly off the bare walls he hadn't yet gyrated. The third notice came on Sunday morning. Mike was attempting to organize his garage, sweating as he stacked boxes against the walls to hopefully make room for his car. The doorbell rang, and when he opened it, no one was there, just another envelope on the welcome mat. This one threatened further action if he continued to willfully violate community standards. That was the last straw. Mike spent his Sunday afternoon hunting through moving boxes until he found his HOA paperwork. He spread everything across his dining table, which still had the plastic wrap on it from the store. Armed with a highlighter and a growing sense of frustration, he carefully read through every page. After 2 hours of reading boring legal language, Mike felt confident. There were rules about parking, but they only said that cars couldn't be parked on the street overnight or left on lawns. Nowhere did it say that residents couldn't use their own driveways. With the relevant sections highlighted, Mike typed up a polite but firm email to the HOA board. He introduced himself as a new homeowner, explained his situation with unpacking, and most importantly, quoted the exact sections of the HOA agreement that showed he wasn't breaking any rules. He even attached photos of the pages with the highlighting. "I'm happy to be part of the Oakwood Estates community," he wrote at the end, "and I look forward to meeting more of my neighbors under better circumstances." Mike felt good after sending the email. He'd handled things like an adult. No yelling, no cursing, just facts and polite communication. Surely the board would see reason. The reply came Monday evening after he got home from work. Mike opened it eagerly, expecting an apology. Instead, the one-sentence response simply read, "Longtime residents' interpretations of the rules take precedence over newcomers' readings, as established by community precedent." It wasn't signed by a specific person, just Oakwood Estates HOA board. Mike stared at his screen in disbelief. What kind of response was that? It didn't even address any of his points or the sections he'd quoted. He stood up and looked out his front window at his car sitting in the driveway. Then he glanced over toward Diane's house, where he could swear he saw a curtain quickly fall back into place. This isn't about rules at all, Mike realized. This is about power. For the next few days, Mike tried to ignore the situation. He went to work, came home, and continued unpacking his belongings. His living room was finally starting to look like a real living room instead of a cardboard box warehouse. He'd even hung up a few pictures and arranged his couch and TV just the way he liked. On Friday, Mike had a particularly tough day at work. His boss had changed a project deadline, forcing Mike to stay late to finish everything. He was exhausted and looking forward to ordering takeout and crashing on his couch for the night. It was almost 7 p.m. when he turned onto his street. The first thing he noticed was the flashing blue and red lights. A police car was parked right in front of his house. What now? He groaned, his stomach sinking. As Mike pulled into his driveway, he saw Diane standing on his front lawn, talking animatedly to a police officer. She was waving her arms and pointing repeatedly at Mike's house and driveway. The officer, a tall guy with broad shoulders who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, turned as Mike's car approached. Mike took a deep breath and got out, slowly, trying to stay calm despite the anger and confusion bubbling up inside him. "Good evening, officer," Mike said, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Before the cop could answer, Diane jumped in. "Yes, there's a problem. This man is illegally parking on property that isn't his. He's been warned multiple times." The officer held up a hand to quiet her. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." He turned to Mike. "Sir, do you live here?" "Yes, I do. I moved in about 2 weeks ago." Mike felt his face getting hot. He couldn't believe someone had actually called the police over this. "Can I see some ID and proof of residence, please?" the officer asked. Mike nodded and pulled out his wallet. "My driver's license still has my old address, but I have the closing paperwork inside with my name on it." Diane crossed her arms triumphantly. "See? He doesn't even have proper ID." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, please." Mike ran inside and grabbed the folder containing all his house paperwork. He brought it back out and showed the officer his deed, closing statements, and mortgage documents. The officer reviewed them carefully while Diane stood by, tapping her foot impatiently. After a few minutes, the officer handed the papers back to Mike. "Everything seems to be in order, sir. You are indeed the legal owner of this property." "So, he's trespassing on HOA property by leaving his car in the driveway," Diane insisted. The officer turned to her with a tired expression. "Ma'am, this is his driveway. It's part of his property. But the HOA rules, that's a civil matter between homeowners and their association," the officer interrupted. "It's not a police matter. We don't enforce HOA regulations." Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But, I'm sorry you were bothered, sir," the officer said to Mike. "I have to respond to all calls, but this is clearly not a police issue." As the officer walked back to his car, Diane shot Mike a venomous look. "This isn't over," she hissed before marching back toward her house. Mike stood in his driveway, paperwork still in hand, watching the police car drive away. His neighbors across the street were peering out their windows, and an older couple walking. Their dog slowed down to stare. Great first impression on the neighborhood, Mike thought. And all because he'd parked in his own driveway. The police incident was the last straw for Mike. That night he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, replaying the embarrassing scene in his head. Around midnight, he got up and opened his laptop. If Diane wanted to play hardball, he needed to get serious about protecting himself. First, Mike started a simple document he titled HOA Nightmare, where he wrote down everything that had happened so far, with dates and times. He described each confrontation with Diane, listed when each notice arrived, and detailed the police incident while it was still fresh in his mind. The next morning, Mike drove to the hardware store and bought a small security camera. It wasn't expensive, just a basic model that connected to his phone. He installed it under the eaves of his garage, positioning it to cover his driveway and part of his front yard. He didn't want to miss anything else Diane might try. This feels crazy, he told himself as he adjusted the camera angle. I never thought I'd need surveillance at my own house. Once the camera was set up, Mike decided to meet some of his other neighbors. Maybe they could help him understand what was going on, or at least give him some advice about dealing with the HOA. He started with the older couple who lived on his other side, the Wilsons. They invited him in for lemonade and seemed genuinely nice, but when he mentioned Diane, they both got quiet. We try not to get involved, Mr. Wilson said, suddenly very interested in his glass of lemonade. Next, Mike tried the family across the street. The dad was washing his car in the driveway, which Mike noted with interest was apparently allowed for some people. When Mike brought up his parking situation, the man looked over his shoulder before speaking. Look, everyone knows Diane's intense, he said quietly. She used to run the HOA board until they voted her out last year, but nobody wants to cross her because she makes life miserable for anyone who does. So she's not even on the board anymore? Mike asked, surprised. Nope, but she still acts like she is. And she's friends with two people who are, so she still has pull. As Mike talked to more neighbors, a pattern emerged. Everyone had a Diane story, from getting violation notices for wind chimes that were too noisy to being reported for putting trash cans out too early. One woman had even been harassed about the color of her garden hose. The most interesting discovery came when Mike met Tom, who lived at the end of the block. Tom had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and knew all the history. The HOA board doesn't even have meetings most months, Tom explained as they chatted in his garage. The current president, Dave, is a decent guy, but he travels a lot for work. I think Diane just takes advantage of that to keep playing Queen Bee. Would Dave know about what's happening with my parking situation? Mike asked. Probably not. Those emails you're getting are probably just being handled by the management company, and they likely just forward whatever complaints they get without checking them. Mike thanked Tom and headed home, feeling slightly better knowing he wasn't alone. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. Diane wasn't an official HOA enforcer. She was just a busybody with too much time on her hands. That evening, Mike downloaded the footage from his new camera and started keeping a detailed log on his computer. If things escalated further, he'd be ready with evidence. It wasn't the housewarming he'd imagined, but Mike wasn't going to be bullied out of his own driveway. A full week passed without any new incidents. Mike had cleared enough space in his garage to fit his car, but on principle, he continued parking in his driveway. Each morning, he checked his security camera footage before leaving for work. Each evening, he reviewed it again when he got home. Wednesday evening. Mike pulled into his neighborhood after grabbing dinner with a coworker. It was getting dark earlier now and the streetlights had just come on. As he turned onto his street, he noticed something strange. A large truck with flashing yellow lights was parked near his house. What the? Mike muttered as he got closer. It was a tow truck, and it was backed up to his driveway. Mike slammed on his brakes and honked his horn. A guy in a neon yellow vest was hooking chains to his car that was parked in his own driveway. Hey, what are you doing? Mike shouted as he jumped out of his car, leaving it running in the middle of the street. The tow truck driver looked up surprised. Just doing my job, man. Got a call to remove an unauthorized vehicle. That's my car in my driveway. Mike's voice was rising with each word as he ran toward his property. The driver pulled a clipboard from his truck. I got paperwork here from Oakwood Estates HOA authorizing removal of an illegally parked vehicle at this address. Let me see that, Mike demanded, his hands shaking with anger as he took the clipboard. The form had his address on it and was supposedly signed by the HOA enforcement officer, a position Mike knew didn't exist. The signature was just a scribble that could have been anyone. This is fake, Mike said firmly. I own this house, that's my car. No one authorized you to tow it. The driver scratched his head. Look, I don't want any trouble. The lady who called said she was from the HOA and had authority. Lady? What lady? Older woman, kinda uptight, talked like she owned the place. Said she was... The driver checked his notes. The head of community standards or something. Mike didn't need to hear anymore. Diane, he said through gritted teeth. Just then, a car pulled into a driveway a few houses down, a man about Mike's age in a button-up, shirt and khakis. Something made Mike call out to him. "Excuse me? Do you live here?" The man looked over, clearly tired after what seemed like a long day. "Yeah, why?" "Do you know who runs the HOA?" The man walked closer, curious about the scene with the tow truck. "I'm Dave Peterson. I'm the board president. What's going on here?" Mike felt a rush of relief. "Dave, I'm Mike. I just moved in. Someone called this tow truck to take my car from my driveway claiming HOA authorization." Dave frowned and looked at the paperwork. "This isn't our form, and that's definitely not my signature. We would never authorize towing from a private driveway." The tow truck driver raised his hands defensively. "Look, I don't want to be in the middle of a neighborhood dispute. If the homeowner is here and the HOA president says there's no violation, I'm out." As the driver began unhooking the chains from Mike's car, Dave turned to Mike with a confused expression. "Who called the tow company?" Before Mike could answer, movement across the street caught his eye. Diane was standing on her front porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. When she realized Mike had spotted her, she quickly went inside, slamming her door. "I think I know exactly who did this," Mike said, pointing his security camera toward Diane's house. "And I've got it all on video." Word spread quickly about the towing incident. Dave, the HOA president, was genuinely shocked by what had happened and called an emergency HOA meeting for the following week. Mike found a printed notice in his mailbox, along with every other homeowner in Oakwood Estates. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that Mike hadn't even noticed before. He spent the days leading up to it organizing his evidence, his security footage, the fake towing authorization, and his log of all interactions with Diane. When Thursday arrived, Mike was nervous. He changed his shirt twice before heading to the meeting, wanting to make a good impression. He'd never been to an HOA meeting before and wasn't sure what to expect. The small clubhouse was packed when he arrived. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood had shown up. Mike spotted Tom, who waved him over to an empty chair. "Biggest turnout I've seen in 5 years," Tom whispered. "Everyone wants to see what happens." Dave called the meeting to order and briefly explained why they were gathered. Without naming names, he described the incident with the tow truck and emphasized that no one had authority to remove vehicles from private property. "Now, I'd like our newest neighbor to share his experience," Dave said, gesturing to Mike. Mike's mouth went dry as all eyes turned to him. He stood up, clutching his folder of evidence, and told his story from the beginning. Moving in, the confrontations, the violation notices, the police visit, and finally, the tow truck. He was careful to stick to facts and avoid angry language, even though his hands were shaking slightly. As he spoke, he noticed other neighbors nodding in recognition. When he finished, several people raised their hands to share their own stories about similar harassment. "I got a violation for my Christmas lights in February," one woman said. "But they were Valentine's Day lights, not Christmas lights. She reported my kid's basketball hoop 3 times," added another neighbor. The stories continued for almost 30 minutes. It seemed everyone had experienced Diane's self-appointed enforcement. Diane herself sat stiffly in the back corner, her face growing redder with each story. Finally, she stood up. "You all should be thanking me," she snapped. "I'm the only one who cares about maintaining property values in this neighborhood. Look at what happens when rules aren't enforced. People parking wherever they want, unapproved decorations, noise at all hours." Dave firmly cut her off. "Diane, you are not an HOA board member. You have no authority to enforce rules, real or imagined. And falsifying documents to have someone's car towed is actually illegal." The meeting concluded with several official actions. The board voted to send Diane a formal cease and desist letter. They clarified the actual parking rules, which did allow driveway parking, and they scheduled a review of all HOA regulations to make them clearer for everyone. As people filed out of the clubhouse, many neighbors stopped to introduce themselves to Mike, welcoming him properly to the neighborhood for the first time. 2 days later, Mike was working from home when he heard a commotion outside. He looked out the window to see a familiar tow truck, the same one from earlier that week. But this time, it was hooking up to Diane's shiny white SUV, which was parked partially blocking a fire hydrant down the street. Mike grabbed a cold soda from his fridge and sat on his front porch, watching as Diane ran out of her friend's house, waving her arms and shouting at the tow truck driver. The driver simply pointed to the fire hydrant and continued securing the vehicle. As the truck drove away with Diane's car, Mike couldn't help but smile. Sometimes justice had a way of working itself out.